Kowalski, analysis.
I'd read a quote of yours earlier that said, sex is one of the most powerful drives you have. It's tough to hack it. So my question is something I wrote about, I wrote a book called Why Waiting Works, which is basically about the practicality of saving sex for marriage.
Yep.
So I talk a lot about sex transmutation in the book, which is a principle I really learned about originally from Think and Grow Rich.
There you go, man. You're on it.
So yeah, can you just talk about that a little bit? Because I'm sure there's people out there that have no idea about that.
And it's so cool you talk about this because I touch on it in Fast This Way. And by the way, you can tell I'm in publishing mode for the book. So if people want to read about all of these things, I appreciate pre-orders greatly because as an author, it matters. But what transmutation does, and I learned when I was 16, I read Think and Grow Rich. I can't say I believed on the transmutation part of it, but later on, I came across some Taoist philosophy and they said, you know what, if you want to live a long time, don't ejaculate too much. And they had a rule, like a math equation, and it's age in years minus 7 divided by 4.
Hold on, let me write that down. Age in years minus 7. So that's
divided by 4. So for you, it's going to be about 8 or 9 days. They're saying don't ejaculate more than every 8 or 9 days or you'll get old. And if you want to live a long time, ejaculate once every 30 days, but keep your orgasm to less than an hour when you do that.
That seems like a lose-lose. So not only do I get to ejaculate less, I have to live longer.
Well, that was kind of my thought. And so I'm like, these guys are full of shit. Okay. A lot of biohacking proves ancient knowledge. So I set out for a year to disprove this. So every time I had sex, every time I ejaculated, I tracked it and I tracked my daily happiness. Right. And I'm married. I have a couple kids. My wife was totally cool with this. So I tested this. I tested just ejaculating whenever you have sex, whenever that happens. And then I tested the once every X number of days. And then I tested once every 30 days. And I published all the data in a graph. And I promise you, there is 100% certainty that there is, in men only, an ejaculation hangover. And so the day after you ejaculate, you just don't like your job as much. You don't like your wife as much or your partner. And it's real. And I saw the data. I'm like, damn it, these old Eastern religion people were right. And I mean, it took a year of this and it's kind of embarrassing to put the data up. You're like, well, this is going to be 30 days, but on day 24, it's like, oops, reset the counter. And the deal is not that you can't have sex. It's just that you don't ejaculate. And if you look at Ayurveda, you look at Tantra, you look at all these practices, they'd kind of figure this out. And what they say is that ejaculation depletes men because we have to make prostaglandins and hormones and stuff that goes into ejaculating. And in women, it doesn't. So for women, frequent orgasms are correlated with higher emotional intelligence and general happiness and just showing up better in the world. So you could be like, this doesn't work. But what you realize when you look at data over time is like, you know what? The less often I ejaculate, the more sex I have. Because you're like, hey, I'm ready to go again. Hey, do you want tomorrow night? Let's have some cuddle time, right? And that's actually good for a relationship. It raises oxytocin, but it also raises that question of, as you're getting close, okay, you'll be like, I am not going to ejaculate. And as you're getting close, there's going to be a voice in your head that says, you know what? Right now, the best decision on earth is to ejaculate. And you'll convince yourself right on the fly that it's time, right? And I know enough people who've been addicts as well. It's like, you know what? I wasn't going to do it. And then I saw whatever that trigger was. I was at the bar. I saw a needle, whatever the trigger is. And you're like, you know what? The best idea in the world right now. And as soon as you do it, you're like, God damn it. Why did I do that?
Right.
It's the same urge, but I know where that comes from now. Like that training in Tibet, the neuroscience work that I've done. I actually have a neuroscience company that trains people's brains. You want me to explain? I can break it down for people listening.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
All right. Everything alive, starting with bacteria, everything bigger. It doesn't matter if you're a plant. It doesn't matter if you're a sheep. It's anything. You got to follow these rules. These are the minimum rules that you can pack into a single-celled organism. They don't have brains. They can't think, but they can follow basic survival things. Step 1, run away from, kill, or hide from scary things. Okay, that's fear, right? And if you don't do that, something will eat you and then your species will end. So all life basically responds to fear with 10 times more intensity than is necessary unless it's actually a real threat. The next thing is everything on Earth, our ancestors died of famine at some point. So we're all afraid of that. So you put 5 times more emphasis on eating everything in front of you. Okay, right? And then The third thing that let me ask you this. The first one is fear. The second one is food. There's something else that all life has to do.
Sex.
Yeah, but it's also an F word.
Fuck.
I was gonna say fornicate but okay, no, I'm kidding. But you know what I'm saying? So there's these 3 F words and you get 3 times more emphasis on that than is actually worth it. So what's really interesting is, have you ever done anything you're ashamed of that didn't come from one of those 3 F words?
Wow. Hold on. I'd have to think about that. I'm sure there has to be something.
No one's ever been able to come up with one.
Really?
So, I mean, if we're talking about addiction is straight up the first F word. It's fear.
Fear.
Right. And you're looking to cover up the fear. Right. And that fear comes from trauma. And what that is when your automated detections, because we're not just single bacteria, we've got to follow those rules. But you have a quadrillion ancient bacteria embedded in your cells calling the shots. They're called mitochondria. So there's, in a lot of your cells, there's 15,000 of these little things looking around going, is that a threat? Is that a threat? And then they talk to each other. Is that a threat? And eventually, like after a quadrillion individual sensors decide if it's a threat, you get this little thing that goes, I don't feel good right now. There must be a threat. And then you feel anxiety. And then you blame the anxiety on something and you look to remove the anxiety. How are you going to remove the anxiety? Well, you can do breath work. You can meditate. You can take a drink. You can do whatever the thing is. You can go jack off, right? Like all of those are ways that people deal with that anxiety. But what's really happening is the threat detection system that gets 10 times more attention. Something is triggering it in your life, but that isn't really a threat. But your body responds as if it's a threat. And then your brain, which is pretty smart, it's like, I know there's a threat because I feel it. Therefore, I'm going to make up a story to justify the threat. And the more traumatized you are, the rougher your birth was, the rougher your childhood was, the more you were bullied, if you're abused, that actually increases the number of things that will trigger you to think that it's a life or death situation. And when that happens, it pulls things away from sex, it pulls things away from food, and it pulls things into fear. Right. And so you're juggling this 10 times emphasis on fear, 5 times emphasis on food, 3 times emphasis on sex. So you miss out on the 4th F word that all life does, which is friend. So bacteria get together, they form yogurt, right? You get sheep, they form a herd. You get people, we form tribes. We're actually wired in our cells to support each other, to be kind to each other, to build communities. But we won't do that if we think someone's trying to kill us. Right. So we're desperate to turn off what's trying to kill us. And what I found over the course of the last 20 years and helping people lose 1 million pounds and all that kind of stuff is that the voice of those 3 that's easiest to silence is the voice about food. And that's why I wrote Fast This Way, because no matter what kind of diet you eat, you don't have to go on the bulletproof diet and all that. If you learn to do things that remove cravings for food, so then you can skip breakfast and just not even think about food versus I'm going to skip breakfast. I'm just going to power through it. Powering through anything sucks. You can do it, but it takes energy. I'd rather put that energy into being a friend, right? Being of service. So you can handle that. You can do a lot of stuff to deal with fear. And you can also, the hardest one actually, maybe fear is the hardest one, but the other one, dealing with sex. That idea, like if I don't have sex, man, you feel like you're going to die. But I'll tell you, you learn to go 30 days while having sex and not ejaculating. Do that a few times. You realize you don't need it to live. And then you can actually be at peace around sex. And you're probably going to be a lot better lover anyway. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And when you're saying, all right, I don't want to have sex until I get married, there's nothing, I don't know if this agrees with your opinions and your learnings and your teachings or not. There's nothing that says you can't actually masturbate. Just don't ejaculate all the time, right? And maybe you want to say, I'm not even going to do that, right? And either one of those, okay. I will tell you that if you learn what it feels like to get close to ejaculating and have enough self-control to not do it, you'll be a lot happier when you do finally end up having sex, right? You can actually learn how to do that. But either way, I'm going to die if I don't get laid voice in your head is absolutely 100% lying, but you've got to teach your body that it's lying, right? And one way, willpower. The other way is show it who's boss. Yeah. And that's why skipping breakfast, like I'm in charge of our food. Don't worry, you're not going to die. And then I'm in charge of our sex. Don't worry, we're not going to die. There's a competing voice in your body that comes from inside your cells. And then there's you, and you just have to train it. Be strong. I'm the boss. And then there's always a constant dance between those two. That's why I wrote Fast This Way, because it's easy to say, I'm going to write a book on fasting. Step 1, don't eat for a while. Step 2, here's a bunch of science about why it's good for you. That's easy. And there's great books like that. But the one about how do you actually do it without suffering in a way that's repeatable for the rest of your life, that was my goal on this. And it takes a little bit of learning.
Yeah.
What do
No,
you think about that masturbation thing? Am I wrong?
dude, there's just a lot to unpack in everything you just said. For me, like, I've been abstinent for 15 of the last 20 years. It has not been fun. Like, honestly, I did it initially because I was just wanting to be obedient to God. I thought that I would get a payoff. God would give me a wife if I didn't sin after a while. Didn't happen. Backslid was what they called in Christianese, rededicated. Again, just wanting to be obedient, and really started to understand the practicality is when I wrote a book, and I made a pretty popular YouTube video about it. But so for me now, it's somewhat selfish. I know that by waiting, I'm going to say my best yes versus my first yes or my 10th yes or whatever it is that I see people make, and then they get into relationships with the wrong people, and that's why there's a 50% divorce rate, and
it does happen.
All kinds of other problems. So for me now, it's somewhat selfish because I have a platform around it, so there's that. But not masturbating is more motivated and probably also wanting to be obedient to God. That whole, like Jesus said, if you lust after a woman in your mind's eye, you commit adultery in your heart. So I'm always thinking about, usually if I'm jerking off, I'm going to be thinking about something that I did that probably wasn't, like
you're feeding the beast.
Yeah. I'm like thinking about something dirty I did with some girl years ago or whatever, something I was not in love with that girl. I was just fucking. So here I am entertaining this idea. And then I still do believe that a thought leads to an action leads to a habit leads to a character leads to a destiny. So if you're thinking about stealing something, let's say a candy bar, after a while, you probably are going to steal a candy bar. So I try to keep it, and I'm not perfect at all. Like, it's just the hardest thing that I've probably ever done, but I've definitely gotten better at it. I'm curious about the whole sex without ejaculating, because that to me almost seems like I've never done that. I probably have done it once or twice, only because like the girl was that bad in bed and I just stopped. But I never did it with any intention. To me, that would be like chewing up with something delicious and then not swallowing it.
Here's the intention. Here's the shift that happens. And so this didn't come naturally to me at all. But what happens is you're like, you know what? My job here is actually to be of service to my partner, right? So I'm going to give my wife a soul-shattering, beautiful connection to the world that is healthy and beneficial and, of service to our relationship. And I'm going to do a really good job on it. And I'm going to achieve mastery in my ability to do that, right? And then it doesn't become about you. It becomes about your partner. Right. And then it's about two people together. Right? But you have to have a partner, I think a committed partner to do that kind of a thing. Right. So when you're married and it is time to make love, you're like, okay, how do I make this the most special experience it can possibly be? And from what I understand from talking with various religious leaders, and I've interviewed the head of the Episcopalian Church on my show, and just personally I've had the opportunity to talk to some great spiritual leaders. They're generally in alignment with that. Like, you can have a spiritual experience in bed in a committed relationship. And when you're not making sex about your pleasure, but it's about your partner's pleasure, I think that's in alignment with, the teachings of God, but I could be wrong.
It sounds 100% accurate. Like, it sounds very selfless. Very unselfish.
It becomes selfless because you're like, the end goal of this is not me ejaculating. The end goal of this is my wife experiencing extreme heights of pleasure and me also experiencing it, but also maintaining control and us having a really special experience. And there are people who will tell you straight up from all faiths that, like, I met God in bed last night. It was a spiritual experience. It wasn't just sex. And to take sex from being dirty and to make it something divine, it is possible, at least for some people.
Yeah, I think that's been a big way the church has dropped the ball. It's like they don't talk about it and they make it dirty. Like, it's not dirty. God invented sex. He created it. It's not supposed to be dirty. Now, there are certain guidelines. So you make sure you're having it with the right person, which again goes back to the whole waiting thing. Yeah, I think that the church largely has dropped the ball on that by not talking about it, because now you got even like pastors having sex with people in their congregations, and just, it's crazy. You mentioned that the whole, like, really being thoughtful of your partner in bed. I used to have an old friend, and he would say to girls before he had sex, he'd be like, I'm guaranteeing you one orgasm, mine.
Oh man, that's the opposite of it.
No, that is the opposite. I just thought it was a funny line. So you're obviously a believer in like no FAP and all that then, because that's basically like seminal retention, right? Where you kind of retain it. Okay.
I have a really good interview with John Gray, and you've got to get John on your show, the Mars and Venus author. He was a monk and he was celibate for 7 years. And he wasn't really willing to talk about that publicly, like we're good friends. And then after his wife passed away, she's the one who's been like, could you not talk about that? So he's just been out there talking about how testosterone drops precipitously after you ejaculate the next day, and what it was like for him being celibate for 7 years versus what it was like when he just said, I'm going to incorporate that into my spiritual practice. And it's a different way of thinking about it, but understanding no FAP. When I first started talking about this very early on in my blog, about 10 years ago, I had a lot of young guys like, Dave, I thought it was a little bit crazy, but I started doing Bulletproof Coffee, which gives you actually more electrons, more energy in the body. And I stopped watching porn and stopped masturbating or just stopped hooking up with random people for a month and sometimes for longer. And they're like, I got a $30,000 raise. I started 2 new companies. Like that transmutation thing, it is so legit. And it's legit for guys. I don't think it works for women from the women I've talked to. But what does work magically is when you have a committed relationship and the woman understands that transmutation is real. A lot of women will feel like if they don't make their man come, that they have failed in bed. And you can turn it around and be like, if you make me come, it's a failure. So it's my job to make you come, like, let's race, right? Yeah. And it takes a lot of the pressure off both partners. And I think it creates better sex, right? And it's not exactly no FAP, not by a long shot, but it is definitely a practice of willpower and determination and partnership. And when you do it, you walk away from that with a lot more energy. And at the time when you're like, I'm like 3 strokes away, there's only one thing I want on earth and it's to finish. And you're like, I'm just not going to do it. And when you achieve that spiritual mastery over the voice in your head and any urge you have, the willpower over your urges translates to your willpower over eating junk food, your willpower over flipping someone off you shouldn't flip off, over yelling at your boss, over substances that you might do. It is one of the ultimate hardest things you can do. Say, all right, I'm going to put the brakes on when everything is not telling you don't do that. But you do that a few times, I think you become a stronger man. You really do.